Let's take a look at Game 6 from the 1972 World Championship, Fischer versus Spassky. So Fischer had the white pieces, and he usually opens with e4, but he played c4, very rare choice for Fischer. It sort of surprised Spassky, but Spassky mentioned before the game, if Fischer doesn't play e4, I'll just play my pet Tartakower variation. And they did transpose into a Queen's Gambit declined. Fischer never had the white side of a Queen's Gambit declined before. In fact, he scoffed at the opening. Okay, and play went right into the key Tartakower position after b6. So let's see how Fischer handles this, see if we can learn something about this opening. Okay, he plays c takes d5. He wants to clarify the pawn structure in the center right away. After Spassky played b6, he declared his intention to post his bishop on b7. So Fischer wants to plant a black pawn on d5 to block that. Okay, Spassky takes with a knight, refusing to put the pawn there, and encouraging a trade of pieces. Bishops get traded, the knights get traded, and the pawn shows up on d5, just as Fischer had wanted. So now that makes the move bishop to b7 look a little bit silly behind that pawn. Rook c1 comes next, half open file. There's going to be some action down that file. Now bishop e6. So Spassky admits my bishop doesn't look so good from b7. So he keeps it on this diagonal. So why does he put it on e6? Well, he's guarding the d5 pawn. For example, he can't play c5 immediately, which is a move he does want to play. He wants to break apart the center here at d4. But if he does it now, after the c pawns get traded, his d pawn is lost. So he needs to guard the d pawn. So he guards it with his bishop. Now the bishop is actually much better placed on e6 than it is on b7, even though in both cases it's facing a pawn. And that's because on, well, it's a lot of reasons, but on e6, it has a future pointed at the queen side. Black is going to want to push his queen side majority, and when he does, when these pawns break apart and the d pawn advances, this bishop will be pointed well to support his pawn advances. The bishop can also act in defense. It can defend the f7 and f5 squares for any action on the king side, and it retains its right to redeploy anywhere on this diagonal. It might move to f5 or g4 in the future. So it's a much better place than b7. Okay, Fischer starts an interesting queen maneuver here, starting with queen to a4, developing his queen. It's not going to stay on the a4 square, but even from a4 it has some purpose. It hits the a pawn, so that kind of keeps the rook on the a file to defend it. But then after the expected move c5, Fischer puts his queen on a3. So that was his intention, this little maneuver here. From a3 it's putting pressure on the c5 pawn. Also it's pinning the c5 pawn right now because there's a queen behind it. Okay, so Spassky puts his rook on the c file to oppose white's rook, and to lend support to c5 he has to defend c5. Then bishop b5, Fischer develops his bishop, gets ready to castle. That's a good square for it. It does restrain the black knight here from coming out. Spassky plays a6, but notice that's not a threat because the pawn is pinned. So Fischer ignores that and plays d takes c5 and then b takes c5. This particular pawn formation, this pawn duo here, is called hanging pawns. And when you're facing hanging pawns, you want your rooks in front of them. So Fischer wants a rook on d1 here. And he wants to pressure the pawns and attack them, maybe win one of them, or force one of them to move forward. If a pawn moves forward, then it weakens the squares around it. For example, if this pawn moves forward, the dark squares are weakened. If this pawn moves forward, the light squares are weakened. And Fischer can make use of those squares. Okay, so Fischer castles. Rook to a7 supports the queen here, so there's no longer a pin on this pawn. Okay. Also, the queen supports the rook, so there's no longer a pin on this pawn. So Spassky is now threatening to win the bishop, so Fischer retreats it to e2. And now compare the positions here. Fischer's pieces are very harmonious. His rooks are connected. His bishop is nestled on a nice square here. The knight's on a natural square. This queen is influencing the queenside pawns here. Spassky's rooks are not connected. They're not defending each other. His knight hasn't developed yet. His bishop is kind of sandwiched between a couple of pawns. So Fischer already has an opening advantage. And so this game is really worth studying to learn more about the Tartakower defense. Okay, then Spassky plays knight d7. He wants to develop. Knight d7, though, just broke the contact between his rook and queen. So that allowed Fischer the powerful knight d4. Okay, so the knight can't be captured for two reasons. The rook would be hanging on the back rank, but also the queen would be hanging. Okay. So knight d4 puts the knight in the center, and it pressures this bishop. Fischer would like to trade his knight for the bishop and then attack on the light squares, because he would have a light squared bishop. Okay, queen to f8. Okay, maybe guarding the queen now, so the queen isn't hanging anymore. All right, and guarding the rook. So now the knight is being threatened. So there's no pin on the pawn anymore. So Fischer takes the bishop. F takes e4, e6 is forced. Now this move is hard for me to fully comprehend, but it's usually denoted with an exclam in annotators' notes. e4. So it's supposedly a very powerful move. Well, he's starting to break down this pawn structure right here. Maybe he's threatening to take this pawn, and Spassky would take back on d5, and then the pawns would be pretty vulnerable, and black would have to continue defending them. But he's also possibly inducing this pawn to come forward, and as I said earlier, that leaves some weak squares, these light squares that this bishop can take advantage of. And that's what Spassky does. He pushes the pawn forward. And now, if you look on the king side, you notice Fischer has a majority. He has 4 pawns to 3 pawns on the king side. He doesn't want to just start pushing them all. He wants to reserve a pawn cover for his king. But he does push f4. Okay, this pawn can move forward, maybe clear the file for the rook, maybe create a passed pawn on the e file. Queen e7, e5, okay, creating all sorts of light squares here for his bishop, fixing this pawn. That pawn on e6 can be a target for the light squared bishop and the queen. Rook b8, trying to activate itself on the b file. But bishop c4, okay, attacking the pawn, which is now sufficiently guarded for the moment. It's also right in line with the king, so maybe Fischer is planning on playing f5, and that pawn would be pinned. So we're going to attack it again and win it, or win it with the bishop. So that's why Spassky moves the king off of the diagonal. And then I love this move, the longest move a queen can make, from a3 to h3. Swings all the way from the queen side to the king side. And he attacks this pawn from a new direction. He leaves these rooks over here practically to do nothing. Okay, he does give up this pawn, but he threatens this very important pawn here. And if he wins that pawn, he'll have a passed pawn and he'll march forward. So Spassky decides to defend his e-pawn with this retreating move, and then Fischer really solidifies his structure on the queen side. This is now unbreakable. There's nothing Spassky can do over here. His rooks have no purpose anymore on the queen side. There's no queen side play at all, which you sometimes get in the Tartakower defense. If he tries to come forward with this pawn and break open the structure, Fischer can even play a4 and stick a pawn right there, and then these pieces would be invulnerable to attack. Spassky does push a5, but Fischer takes the time to play f5 to attack that e6 pawn again. It's attacked 3 times, so Spassky gives it up. Rook takes back, knight to h7. Okay, maybe he's threatening to jump into g5 here, attack the queen. Rook cf1, doubling rooks here. Very menacing, all the pieces pointed at the king side. There's an attack now. Queen d8, maybe defending the back rank. Okay, and then queen g3, shifting to a new file. Rook e7, opposing the passed pawn on e5. h4, guarding the g5 square so the knight can't come forward. So the knight's really not doing anything. It's corralled by these 2 pawns. These 2 pawns have that knight corralled. Okay, it also can't come back here. It'll get taken. So Spassky's slowly being smothered here on the king side. Okay, rook b7, trying to protect the 7th rank, trying to protect this pawn. e6, blocking his own bishop, but the pawn's well defended there, and he's now rendered this rook kind of immobile because anytime that rook moves, white has the threat of pushing the pawn further to e7 and opening up the diagonal again. Rook bc7, queen e5 centralizing the queen, lending more support to the pawn, attacking that pawn and that pawn. Queen e8. Now Fischer is in such a commanding position here. Spassky can't do anything productive to get out of this mess. So I found that move kind of funny. a4, Fischer's saying, well, I've got time. I'm just going to push a4, stop you from pushing your a pawn. And then queen d8. And another funny move, I don't understand this one at all. Rook from the first rank to f2. I don't know why that rook is on that rank right now. But again, Fischer has total command over the position, and he can afford to waste tempi. The queen dances back and forth here. Rook to f3. I don't know why I didn't go to f3 in the first place. Maybe there's some weird grandmaster triangulation going on that I don't see. I don't know. Queen to d8, back and forth. Okay, now Fischer redeploys his bishop to another threatening diagonal here. So we're going to expect some action. Queen e8, queen e4. Yeah, he's just formed a battery here against h7, so he's threatening a win. For example, if Spassky just makes some non-move, you have rook check, knight takes, rook takes knight, followed by a mate on h7. So there is a threat now down this diagonal. So knight f6, blocking the f file from the rooks, and the knight's still protecting that square. Although, what's going to happen if white takes the knight? Okay, well, g takes f6 allows the rooks to now defend h7. But then rook takes f6, king to g8. Okay, maybe getting off of that h file. Bishop c4, pointed back at the king again. King h8, queen f4, and black finally resigned. Okay, I think he was in a lost position for a while here, but the threats are just too great. Queen takes h6 is a threat, rook takes h6 is a threat, rook to f8 check is a threat, winning the queen. this rook is going to be a poor defender to block anything because the pawn will be pushed and that will unleash the bishop. So there's really no way out of this. Let's check the engine. So yeah, engine gives white, and it took a few seconds, but it finds a mate in 7. Okay, so I'm curious. Let's play through the mate in 7. Queen G8, Queen E5. This is best play, apparently. Rook H7. It's going to look silly. These things always look silly. Black has to just give up pieces to prolong the inevitable. Yeah, this is not at all how humans would play, but nevertheless, that was best play. Okay, so at the end of that game, Spassky stood up and applauded Fischer, and that took Fischer into the lead in the match for the first time. He actually lost the first game of the World Championship match. He forfeited the second game because he didn't show up. The organizers of the tournament didn't meet his demands for removing some cameras that were making noise. So Fischer forfeited the second game. He was down 2 games. I think he bounced back and had a win in either game 3 or 4. I think he had 2 more wins, in fact. And then game 6 was a third win for Fischer, so he went up in the match. I think he was up a point after this game, or half a point after this game. All right, well, that was a good opening lesson in the Tartakower. I hope you enjoyed the game.